No, we're not yet.
Okay, let me know when we are, because I actually...
Yeah.
This is
Oh
strange.
my God, I nearly left the Zoom call. So.
Stay with us.
We're almost.
This virtual weird world.
I'm tidying up my my computer so that I don't have 20,000 things open.
Yeah, same.
We're almost on.
Oh.
Yeah, we're on YouTube.
Yeah, I can hear myself in the television in the living room, right? This is strange. Yeah, I think we're live now everywhere on no, not Instagram. That's the only one we're not live. We are live on YouTube and Facebook. So yeah, welcome to the first event of Quinzena'21. This will be a session in English, so I guess I can explain what quinzena means. Quinzena comes from the Portuguese word quinze, which is 15, so 15 days. So for the next 15 days, which amounts to about 3 weeks, every Wednesday and Friday we'll have an event like this one, always kind of moderated and hosted by myself and INSTITUTO. Where we'll talk about various themes relating to contemporary architecture. Quinzena is a festival in its third edition. Normally it's in INSTITUTO in Porto, but this year is the first time it is online, which is also exciting in different ways. And today's theme is rewilding. We are joined by 3 great people from, I thought London, but not London. Where are you, Christina?
Well, I'm.
Is it a secret?
For the purpose of these, yes, London. But I divide my life between 2 places. Well, actually 3 places. One is London, the other one is Sussex, and the other one is Porto.
Okay, so but today you are in the UK, somewhere in the beautiful country. And then we have Thiago, who is talking to us from Porto.
Yes, hi all again. Yeah, I used to be in London as well, but yeah, right now, Porto.
Okay, Porto. And then Vilde from Bergen, from the exotic west coast of Norway.
Very exotic here.
Yeah. We will start with presentations from each person, and the presentations will be followed by a conversation between all of us. And during the presentations and also the conversation, feel free to write any questions or comments wherever you're watching, on Facebook or YouTube or social media. This is the first event, so we're kind of seeing how things are working, but I think it will be great. So now, Christina, the screen is yours.
Oh gosh, okay.
Not the floor, the screen.
So let me just, how do I do this? Yeah, are you able to see my screen? First of all, I wanted to say thank you, Catarina, for inviting me to talk today. Yeah, to tell you a little bit about myself. My name is Christina Monteiro. I'm a director of an architecture practice called DKCM, based in London. And we're concerned with both natural and built environments. Primarily, we work for the public sector on projects that are quite strategic, urban projects, but we also work on a kind of broad range of scales. So our work sort of bridges, the strategy and the sort of very small details of the and impacts of the kind of wider strategies that we work on. But primarily, we are practitioners that think holistically about both natural and built places. So I think I might have been invited today because of an article that I wrote for the zine in November, so at the end of last year. And the reason I wrote this article was because I really needed to somehow piece together all the things that were happening in my life and all the opportunities my brain was sort of putting together. And as I said earlier, I am someone that sort of is divided between country and city. And during the lockdown last year, the first lockdown, I was able to survive these restrictions because I had an amazing landscape to walk. So a national park called the South Downs. And when the lockdown eased, going back to the city became a real challenge. And I was faced with understanding that access to nature is one of privilege. And somehow the movement of rewilding in the UK is something that's been becoming popular for a few years. But last Christmas, Christmas 2019, these two books, very different voices, were very much bestsellers, and I was reading them. So this is pre-pandemic, and they are such different takes on this issue. One, Isabella Tree, Wilding. It's about the process of a couple, a very privileged couple, that own an estate in Sussex and wanted to turn it back to nature. And it's a really wonderful encounter of how hard that process was, and a really compelling story. So, and the other, Feral by George Monbiot, is a very different take on rewilding, and is one that also captured my imagination in relation to, you know, how can we make our cities places where there's more ecological diversity. And I think that front cover image is something that's sort of haunting me ever since. When I'm standing at my kitchen window in London, I often look down this very hard view and hope for a deer to emerge. But the walking upstream is something that that during lockdown really sort of made lockdown bearable for us. And that sort of connects me back to my own childhood, where playing with welly boots and roaming the land was allowed. And I'm very aware that that context is not one that most children today, especially in our cities, have access to on a regular basis. And in London and in the UK and in there is a movement for forest schools whereby children in their schools and in the curriculum learn about nature, but that's quite restrictive. But it really has made my own child very alert to nature. And so when we walk upstream and when we're exploring landscapes, she's very eager to explore the nature. And for instance, this is a little newt we found, and Amelia, sure enough, wanted to film it and wanted to draw it. And, you know, who knows, maybe she's going to become a botanist. And I'm enjoying this journey that I have with my own daughter. But also, engaging with nature is an individual thing, but it's also a collective thing. And, you know, making dens, climbing trees can be a great fun and can be a great collective experience. Again, making space and room and time for children to just be on their own around nature, it's really vital. And there's so many books written recently, but also from the 60s and 70s about how important access to nature is for our children. So I'm going to show you 3 projects that at DKCM we have been developing in parallel to me and my family exploring this beautiful landscape. So right at the beginning of the lockdown, we were commissioned by the Mayor of London to do a research project and a design guidance on this idea of an expanding definition of what London's public realm was, to make it a bit easier to understand. Understanding that there are a lot of public realm that's delivered and owned by private sector, and trying to make that public realm more public. So in that study and design guide, we developed many principles, but I think one of, for me, the critical principle was really the ecology and environmental aspects. And trying to think that to make a more dense city, we need to think about a more dense city that it's more dense in not just in one aspect, but also in diversity of ecology. So the guide, so for that, sorry, I'm just trying to, we wanted to make sure that planting that's planted is diverse and creates ecosystems rather than monocultural. We wanted to make sure that buildings play a positive role in water mitigation and recycling of water and reuse of water for a wider, more diverse ecology. And really thinking holistically about green infrastructure, and that may be that some spaces are accessible for wildlife and less for people. Or so, for instance, this precedent that you can see it's quite a lovely precedent, because, you know, quite often these sort of green verges are basically grass that gets trimmed and potentially very poor in terms of biodiversity. If there is a maintenance strategy around that, we can really create urban places that have the quality of the countryside. So another one of the projects that we were working on whilst the pandemic started, and that we started working on, is a spatial vision for a garden community. This particular one is called Emil. And again, a key kind of principle for that was thinking about the green network. So thinking about all the different types of working green infrastructures and how that they become like the key kind of focus of the development. To give you a sort of overall sort of picture of garden communities, the Garden City movement actually originated in the late 19th century and had really some real traction post 100 years ago, really post the influenza of the early 20th century. So for us, piecing things together, it makes us feel that it's really vitally important that we start thinking again about, you know, how our cities can expand into becoming more connected in nature, and how can nature play a more physical role in our cities. And the third project I wanted to talk about is a canal placemaking strategy we did. Actually, this project we did a year ago, but currently we're delivering a tiny bit of it. So the canal placemaking strategy is a strategy commissioned by the Mayor of London again and the OPDC, which gave the planning team tools to think about how can we make the canal more accessible. And for us, we viewed very much the canal as a sort of an environmental and an ecology corridor, and a key principle for us is how to make the canal more biodiverse, and how can we use that biodiversity and to sort of promote that biodiversity in multiple ways, including educational. So we're currently the project gained planning permission in November and is now being priced by the contractor. And the principle here was to make a new entrance that bridged 2-meter drop, but also that it's accessible and complies with the standards for accessibility, but also is the entry point for a park and a nature reserve. So we had to work really hard on a very thin slither of land to make that balance between nature and humans. And that process has been very difficult, but hopefully the result will be a tiny bit of nature reserve. And there's a growing movement around rewilding in cities, and I'm sure that my colleagues will talk further on that. I think I'm particularly interested at the moment by the Miyake forest movement, which is about planting trees very close together to create kind of mini forests. And I think an invitation that I ask everyone is to look at their immediate context and to think how can they support their immediate context to become more rich and more biodiverse. So this is a map of my local area, which is framed by 2 schools and a farm, and a park that is, in terms of biodiversity, very deprived. So here we reimagined the park as becoming a nature reserve, that it becomes a place for a forest school. So I don't know whether you see my mouse. Oh, no, it doesn't allow me. But yes, so reimagining my local park as a nature reserve, which would mean that we could create a bit of the countryside within a very densely populated built environment in zone 1 of London, but also that could come with a mini educational center and bring 2 schools and a farm together to look after and use these displays. And that's me. Thank you.
Super, thank you for that. And now we have Tiago, right? The screen is yours. Thank you for that, Christina.
Hi again. Should I share my screen?
I'm trying to stop my screen.
Okay. Wonderful, thank you. Okay, okay. Hi, thanks again. Hi all. Thanks, Catarina, for the invitation, and thanks to Quinzena and INSTITUTO. I'm pleased to be in conversation with yourself, with Christina and Vilde. What I'm presenting today, it's a work in progress investigation of a very different nature from Christina's work, I must say, that looks at environmental harm, in particular. I'm looking at mercury contamination and also garimpagem, which is this informal gold mining practice in the Brazilian Amazon, in Tapajós River Basin in Pará state. I'd like to start by introducing a term that somehow responds to the idea of rewilding, which is the term of recuperation. I feel like rewilding, it's a kind of a tricky notion in the context of Amazon, so I'd like instead to offer this notion of recuperation or even partial recuperation. I take it from Donna Haraway. She calls for a commitment to the modest possibilities of recuperation as getting on together has a possibility of reviewing ways of living and dying attuned to possible finite flourishing. I think I may agree with Christina on this point. It's somehow a banal commitment to the social environmental context of ours, but I believe that this term speaks accurately to the conditions that I attempt to grasp here. So I'd like to move on to a small episode in the Tapajós River Basin in the Pará state. So when mercury is mixed with a gold-rich ore, the liquid metal bonds with a precious element in a process called amalgamation, which is known for centuries, and it was also a crucial step in, for instance, alchemy. A mercury-gold amalgam is easily broken by fire, and the burning process is deemed as an effective method to isolate the gold particles. When fire burns this elemental affinity, golden grains are rendered visible, while a distinct metallic taste is felt in the human tongue, a sign of mercury vapor being released. As Gabriel H. puts it, this is a particularly blurry moment during which both value is created, when gold is rendered visible, and violence is performed in the beginning of the mercury contamination in the Amazon. This episode of amalgamation is central to the Brazilian Amazon's garimpagem. The latter, an informal gold mining practice, is these days deployed in epidemic proportions in the Tapajós River Basin with enormous consequences: contaminated human and non-human bodies, deforested areas and moonscape-like terrains, as you can see in the image, and toxic air, water, and soil. In Tapajós River Basin, these artisanal extractive practices are the greatest project of environmental violence. And although all of these practices are virtually illegal, all of them in the region, garimpagem is also the most important economic activity in the river basin. So it is this relational complexity that the project tries to unpack. And I'll attempt to do so in 3 parts. The first one is called Matters in Relation. So among the many forms of violence perpetrated by garimpagem, mercury contamination is one of its most insidious conditions, and it was my entry point to attempt to understand the here and now of garimpagem, but also to unpack other temporalities and tentacular conditions. For that here, I share three conditions, kind of 3 spatial analyses in the area of Pará. The first one deals with deforestation as a mercury dispersion catalyzer, because Amazon is a natural sink of atmospheric mercury. While trees are known to keep soil minerals in place during rain seasons, deforestation disrupts such modes of coexistence. Accumulated mercury in soil is eroded, potentially reaching aquatic ecosystems, which is a key moment in the transformation of mercury from an inorganic state, kept stable in the soil, to an organic one, heavily toxic, that initiates a complex propagation process among a myriad of rainforest elements. This is what Annette Singh would call perhaps these co-temporalities between humans and non-humans, because mercury moves from soil to water to fishes to humans, etc. So here I traced the deforestation in Pará state from 2001 to 2015. And you can see these reddish shapes are the deforested areas. And one can see also kind of the typologies of deforestation, which are along the roads in the Amazon. So in the Tapajós region, a growing body of scholarship relates deforestation to mercury contamination. The second condition deals with the proliferation of garimpagem in the Munduruku indigenous territory. In this basin, the Munduruku indigenous peoples are among the most severely affected by environmental violence. In search of gold, garimpagem is blatantly invading the Munduruku indigenous territory. Disruption, it's most recognizable through the discarded toxic ponds, which can be seen resorting to flyovers, as you can see in this video. The video is also useful to see kind of the spatial typology of the mining sites, this juxtaposition of the toxic ponds, which can also be seen here in this photogrammetry of the same place. So here one can see the portion of the Munduruku indigenous territory. And more specifically, we can see a Munduruku village called PV. So in this site, these toxic ponds were traced resorting to remote sensing technique called NDWI, Normalized Difference Water Index. And again, I use this technique to identify the mining sites, and the colored shapes are these same toxic ponds. Here, the invasion of the Munduruku territory was traced from 2015 to 2019. And on the 12th of January of 2018, the Munduruku community announced that the indigenous village called PV, that we saw before the timeline, no longer existed. In a public announcement made by the indigenous group, one can read, "Garimpos invaded all, brought diseases, killed the forest and farm, brought prostitution, alcohol, drugs." Forced migration is yet another form of aggression in the region, adding up to the fabric of chains of actions and lateral relations, where contamination and diseases continue to play an important role. So the third condition, I call it harm by indirection. So after geolocating this locus of mercury dispersion, I moved on to map the landscapes of contamination in the region. So as a means to examine the levels of toxicity in Tapajós, I collected the available epidemiologic studies, analyzed and located them. These assessments were later compared with the World Health Organization's threshold of concern, which can be seen on the top right, which is that white line. For each assessment, one can see its location, which is the dot in the map, and the level of contamination, which is both the radius of the circle and also the yellow bars on the top right. The analysis was done between 1995 and 2014. The studies show a consistency in contamination assessments over the years. In other words, mercury contamination is indeed a pervasive condition of toxicity in Tapajós River Basin, whose harm goes beyond its most expected victims. In fact, the overall investigation shows different mediums of contamination in different moments of mercury cycle. While miners are contaminated by inhalation of the mercury vapor during the burning of the amalgam, which I've seen at the very beginning of the presentation, traditional and indigenous populations with a fish-rich diet are contained via their digestive system, that is, they eat contaminated animals. Both miners, locals, and indigenous communities are thus subjected to the pervasive geographies of contamination. The result is a project of harm by indirection that may perhaps blur the notions of victim, perpetrator, and crime. However, this process of violence remain unnoticed in the region. They don't trigger any kind of social protection. Move on to the second main chapter called Marginal Deep History. So after addressing these current conditions of contamination, the second moment of analysis attempted to unpack the structures that initiated and sustained these forms of environmental harm. For that, I looked at the histories of this Amazonian frontier area and its narratives of statecraft. What this analysis pointed to was an insistence on the marginalization of garimpagem. In parallel, revisiting these narratives shed a light on the growing frictions between these illegalized form of extraction and the other large-scale mining endeavors. Just a brief historical note on garimpagem. This practice has existed for more than 250 years, at least documented. However, it was not until the 20th century that the first attempts to legal codify the informal mineral extraction were carried out. The name itself, garimpagem, holds an extra legal connotation. The notion relates to Garimpas, the hills of Minas Gerais, in where diamond extraction was executed out of the control of the state. So divisions between non-regulated and clandestine mining on one hand, and regulated and slave-based mineral extraction on the other, can be traced as early back as the 17th century. So this project started really as a look at illegal mining, but very rapidly I realized that a more nuanced reading was required. So garimpagem was legally addressed for the first time in 1934. It was a period of particular sensibility towards the informal practice. In various moments, governmental bodies recognized the exploitative nature of garimpagem and the need for state protection of the miners themselves. However, the military coup of 1964 marked a dramatic change in the relationship with garimpagem, with the reformulation of the legal status of the extractive endeavor that greatly catalyzed conflict between the formal structure sector and the small-scale practice. The renewed Código de Mineração, published in 1967, explicitly favored large-scale mining. This is a key moment in opening up the Amazon to large-scale mining companies and helps to explain the rapid growth of large-scale mining activities in the Amazon during the coming decades. Furthermore, the laws created a binary divide between the corporate mechanized modes and garimpagem. The absence of in-between categories, together with the explicit reference to informal practice as an individual endeavor, have further disconnected the legal realm from the reality in the rainforest and crucially placed garimpagem once again in clandestinity. What's more, a major contributing condition to promote conflict was the easy access of large-scale mining companies to prospecting licenses. Few requirements were demanded to get these licenses, which were indefinitely renewable. Because these permits were so easy to get, speculative extractive projects proliferated. And while the conflicts of this sort were particularly accentuated during the 1970s gold rush, the same patterns can be identified nowadays. In the Tapajós River Basin, which you can see again in the image, new players include multinational prospective companies and mid-scale mining companies. These corporations currently own prospecting rights over most of the basin, as you can see here as these orange geometric shapes. It is likely that confrontations between legal and illegal endeavors increase in the near future. More recently, various critiques have addressed the minor efforts put into effectively controlling garimpagem. Although new environmental laws have been created, it is widely acknowledged that assistance programs on the ground are insufficient and no enforcement has been accomplished. Ultimately, a persistent continuum of governmental neglect over the enforcement of existing and emerging laws is evident on the ground, culminating in a blatant failure in reducing environmental harm or alleviating the frameworks of socio-political injustice produced within and by garimpagem. In turn, this lack of clarity and action culminates in an extractive practice that is harmful to both humans and non-humans, and that is deemed both unregulatable and uncontrollable. As a common saying among informal gold miners goes, only two circumstances seem to stop garimpagem: the bad weather and the lack of gold. So I'll just move on to the very last chapter, called negative commonality. So a conundrum arises. On the one hand, a politics of neglect enacted by the state towards garimpagem is perpetuated since the 1960s. On the other hand, an illegalized gold mining practice, often seen as a mode of subsistence, is causing a pervasive condition of toxicity and environmental violence. This is perhaps what philosopher Achille Mbembe calls a negative moment, an instance when new antagonisms emerge while old ones remain unresolved. This condition in Tapajós is further inhabited by a persistent mercury contamination, which is ubiquitous throughout the continuum of unresolved crises, which I call here negative commonality. In fact, mercury has been used in the Brazilian Amazon since at least the 19th century. In the collapse of the rainforest, both environmentally but also socially, it is my belief that this lens of negative communality may offer us a clearer view over these tenuous spatial temporalities of Tapajós and perhaps catalyze new alliances, unfold new forms of resistance, and perhaps contribute to a new lexicon of operations. As Michelle Murphy notes, new vocabularies of care and responsibility requires us to look for collaborative ways of working that attempt to puncture both processes of dismantlement and world building. In this vein, looking at the Tapajós current condition through the lens of its negative commonalities necessarily compels us to work with and against garimpagem. Projects of emancipation and acts of resistance are already taking place in Tapajós. Munduruku peoples have offered courageous resistance to a multiplicity of threats. Endeavors include forms of counter-mapping as a means to delimit indigenous territories, as well as directly tackling insistent and uncontrolled practices of garimpagem. Continuing to pursue jurisdiction at large over indigenous lands is as well of paramount importance. Not far from Tapajós, in the Xingu River Basin, NGOs are teaming up with local miners against the invasion of multinational gold mining corporations, a way more destructive threat. And responding to the temporalities of contamination and slow violence, notions of slow activism and slow observation has a mean to situate forms of partial recuperations that avoid immediate observable outputs may expand environmental politics towards new formulations. If to tackle the quasi-events of toxicity invite us to pay attention to the forces of condensation or endurance, as anthropologist Elizabeth Povinelli puts it, such expansions of what a political act can be may well be a meaningful praxis to pursue. Just to sum up, returning to the very beginning, these possibilities of recuperation across difference, this selective resistance, seem indeed attuned to a possible finite flourishing. It's a form of indeed staying with the trouble, again, an expression by Harvey, that is part of an ongoing commitment of some of these Amazonian peoples to live and die in responsibility. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Tiago. And now Vilde, super.
Thank you so much. I have to stand up. Then I feel like I'm having a real presentation. I've taken this home office very seriously, so I have this great desk. Anyway, thank you so much for those two presentations. That was very cool to see. I'll try to share my screen here. Desktop. Can you see something now? Sorry. Okay. I'm so sorry. I have issues with sharing my screen.
No problem. Are you?
I have to close the program.
Okay, just close it and
Is it okay?
Yeah, yeah.
You will entertain them.
Yeah, I will talk about something. No, but it's super interesting because it's like we are dealing with extreme different scales of essentially the same theme of like humans basically destroying the landscape, and the value of bringing it back is a theme that I'm interested in, and I hope we can talk about it more towards the end. And I think what Vilde is going to talk about
Here I am.
Interesting.
Can you see me now? Yeah, that was just a little technical moment, which we all have gotten very used to. So
Yes.
Here we are. Can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Okay. So my name is Vilde, and I'm going to share with you a project series, actually, that we call landscape healing that we've been working on in our office. And especially I'm going to talk about one of the projects in this project series that that I've been working on for the past year, together with 2 architects and 1 planner in our office. And I thought it was funny that Christina also showed where she was from, because I also wanted to just show a picture from where I'm from. My background is from visual communication. That's my education. So that means that I usually tell people that I'm a graphic designer. So I'm not an architect, but it's great to be here. I work in a multidisciplinary office in the west coast of Norway, and we do all kinds of projects like healthcare and housing and refurbishments and the whole spectrum. And for the past 20 years, we've also been consultants for the Norwegian Defence Estates Agency, who is the largest property manager in Norway. And we've done about 30 different sites for them, there are areas that they have used for military training, and then we help them figure out what they're going to do with these places. So 2 years ago, there was a documentary film that was made about this project series that focused quite a lot on this area that you can see in the picture. That was a total nature restoration into like a national park status. But when we do landscape healing, it doesn't always mean that. For example, it can mean that the military wants to continue the activity that they've been doing, and then we help them make improvements so that it's less harmful to the environment. Or it can mean complete cleanup, and that's can be quite brutal interventions to the landscape. So it's not really like planting some trees, it's quite intense. So one of the questions that I had first when I learned about this project series, Landscape Healing, before I started working on it myself, was kind of, what have we done? As creative professionals, it's a very complex project, and it involves a lot of different experts, and it can be a little bit confusing to know really what does an architect or a designer do in this process. And I can only say what I've done, and it's a 3-step process. So it's a research and a briefing, and then we do a site visit, and then we collect all the things into, in this case, a report. So the first phase, we start, and this place where we are now working is in the east part of Norway, not so far from Oslo. And the Norwegian Defence Estates Agency, they already conduct a lot of research on all these different topics. So one of the first things that we did was to have a meeting with each and every one of them, so we could get an idea of the situation there. And then immediately, as we started with these meetings, we visualized all the meeting notes, so instead of having like a typical written note, we made illustrations or maps and sent it back and forth to make sure that all of the experts kind of agreed that we had understood correctly. So then we did more typical research into documents that they have about what kind of ammunition there is and what kind of training they have been doing there and that kind of stuff. And we also did research on old newspaper articles and historical sources, etc.
Vilde, sorry to interrupt. I think we are only seeing your desktop. A very beautiful photo.
Are you kidding?
No, I'm sorry. Because at the beginning I thought maybe you were talking about the photo on the desktop, but I think Yeah, we can only see, we are not seeing your PDF. That's strange.
Well, that was good that you said.
I'm sorry, I should have noticed before, but now that you were moving on, I could notice that.
Can you share? I will share again. I'm sharing then this. Can you see it now? Something else now?
No, the same.
Can you see something else now?
No. Ah, yes. Now we can. Super.
I can then go quickly through them.
Yeah.
Then you probably listened very well since you had only one thing to look at. So this is where I'm from. This is where we work. This is where we are now working on this site. This is the film still from the documentary that was made. This is a shooting range that we have been improving. This is a place that we have been cleaning up. Yeah, this is the big question. What have we actually done? Here is the 3 steps that I started explaining. And here we are with the experts: pollution, explosives, cultural heritage, biodiversity. And then there is the meeting notes that we started to visualize. Is this okay that I do it like this? Good. Yeah, and then there are documents, historical documents, and then the site visits, and here we are. I'm sorry. So this place, I can give you a full screen here. This is a quite large area. So this is the shooting range that we've been working on. And that's about 11 square kilometers, something like that. And that's 26 different shooting ranges in this whole area. And then only 3 or 4 of them are still in use today. And then in preparation to this site visit, I can go back to that. We did a study of all the shooting ranges that had marsh, because marsh is a nature type that if the shooting ranges are very near to that, then and there is pollution, it adds a lot of complexity to, for example, if you're going to clean up or, yeah. So that was one thing that we did as kind of a preparation to the site visit. Then we also did made a checklist together with the experts, which I don't understand everything that's on the checklist, but the idea was that we were going to go through every shooting range there and then get the same information for every one of them. And that is, yeah. And then we were out there ready to go. This was the beginning of June. We were prepared for 2 days site visit when the snow had melted, because this area is about 400 to 600 meters above sea level. And then these are the experts that we had talked to already in the meetings. And then we also had a veteran officer with us who could give us information on historical use and undocumented use. So we went there and we took thousands of photos, at least a few thousand, and saw everything there was to see. And then one very important task that is extremely important part of the project was to name every single photo with the range number and a concrete description of everything that was there, or else the next step would have been absolutely impossible. So that was something we did at night in this site visit when we came home. And then the last part is to kind of make sense of all the information that we had gotten into a report. And that was after the summer. So then we had to kind of a little bit of distance from the site visit. And this is a part of the process where you kind of have to trust trust it, because you don't know really the answers yet, or the questions, and you have to put everything together, and then you will see sort of the whole picture in the end. And the experts had also taken some results, some tests, and we got the results back from them. And from these very impressive sheets of numbers, we started to asking them what this means and place it into the map to try to simplify what we saw. And this is mapping all the polluted or the places with more pollution, and with the blue dots also that had marsh. And then we were kind of starting to layer up the issues there. And in addition to covering all of these important main themes, every shooting range is documented in the report with all the evidence from the site visit and all of the previous, like the documents that they already had. So we add on all that. There's a lot of photos to kind of explain how it really looks there. And then we used all these captions that we had written during site visits. And then also we had a drone with us, so we got to see the landscape from above and combined it with more detailed photos to get a clear image of the situation. And some ranges have a lot of very polluted marsh, and that we could see especially some places from above. And also some places, yeah, there's all kinds of things that you learn in this project. For example, if you can see here is some old projectiles that I found in this specific place. And these are important because this is something that I've learned, that when you shoot at the rocks, then these projectiles, they shrivel up, and then they have a larger surface, and then more metals can leak out. So this we had to like kind of make very clear in the report. Some of the ranges had a lot of like scrap, and some of them had risk of explosives, which we could not walk into. So we had to just take the drone photos into it in the end. And then when we had started to get sort of the overview, we could start to classify these places into different colors. We used a basic traffic light system, which works very well until you run out of colors. So there's the not polluted, not dangerous. That's like the best you can have. And then polluted, not dangerous, like information, dangerous, not polluted, dangerous, unpolluted. And then there's the water and marsh factor and the scrap thing. So then we placed it into the map, and then you start to make some kind of conclusions, or you get closer to it. And then this is of course done in, we had meetings with the Defense States Agency, and yeah, so the idea here is that, or the goal is that if you don't know this place, every range in this field in and out, then you still can get an idea from this report that is quite general, but also detailed enough to be able to make an informed decision about what's going to happen to it. So we are now working on finishing up with some last points, and this is kind of maybe illustrating some of the complexity of what this looks like. You know, it's there's a lot of different factors, and they affect each other. So each range is not an isolated shooting range with only its own issues, because you know, there's water flowing and there's air to move in. So yeah, that's kind of where we are now, and then we will hand it over like any day now, and then we're starting on a new area, so which is going to be very exciting, and that's kind of what we do in landscape healing. We take a lot of different information and make sense of it. So yeah, thank you.
And then imagine a crowd full of people clapping.
It's a bit weird, we cannot see who's watching, but I bet there's at least one.
At least 100?
Maybe, who knows?
At least if
I'm
there's
receiving
one.
loads of messages, so that's positive.
Okay.
That's good.
Different people. So yeah, I think we got a following.
My husband is watching in the living room, and that I can hear. And my baby is banging the door, trying to get in. So if you hear screams, don't be terrified. But thank you for those really interesting presentations. I love that they're all very different scales and approach. There's almost too much to talk about, and I'm going to start by the idea of value. I worked a little bit on the landscape healing project indirectly. When I was at FRW, I produced the film. So I had a lot of conversations with these military people about what is the value of restoring landscapes? What is the worth of a human life? Why is the government paying so much? And a concept that I'm very interested in is this contrast between our traditional idea of what nature is, and it's very clear in the British countryside. For me, the British countryside is like this peaceful, beautiful, bucolic, I don't know how you say that, pristine idea of nature untouched, even though it's very much man-made. But anyway, that's the idea of the, I can't remember the name right now, of the meadows in the UK, contrasted with the violence of how humans treat nature and the environment. So whether it's building in urban areas, or whether it's for military training or mining for profits, they're basically reasons that we humans have found to harm the landscape. And we, the people doing this, for them, it's financially, it makes financial sense to do this. There's value in doing that. So I am interested in talking about what you guys think of how can we quantify the benefits to society to restore pieces of nature. And this might be at all three scales that we have here. So looking at our neighborhoods and seeing where we can add ecological diversity, or, you know, uncovering all these mining crimes, environmental crimes really, that are being done in the Amazon forest. Or in restoring pieces of land in Norway. What I know the most is in Norway, the Norwegian context. But yeah, I'm interested in hearing what you guys think, and if the public has any questions, we are also open to that.
Shall I start?
Yeah.
Am I muted? I don't know.
No, I can hear you.
Hi. I think, yeah, it's really interesting to be sharing a forum with the three of you, and you know, primarily the rewilding movement is something that's been very much concerned with large landscapes and the countryside. And as a city architect, for me, it was about learning from this movement and how can we bring that concept of healing landscapes into our urban environments to really bridge the gap that there is between the wealthy and the poor that have less access to nature and like less access to diversity in nature. I think issues with monoculture are seen on a variety of levels. So, for instance, in Portugal, we have a huge issue in relation to the replacement of our forests with the eucalyptus tree plantation, which is something that has caused huge harm to a vast amount of landscapes. And it's something that I call Portuguese architects to do something about in relation to planning and our spatial planning. For instance, we had major fires at the same time as the Grenfell fire here in the UK, whereby kilometers and kilometers of monocultural eucalyptus plantations, so-called forests, which they are not forests, and really, I think we've got an issue in Europe, and not just in Europe, but I think we should set an example on the definition of what forest means. Because if we can make sure a forest is described as a place of diversity and ecosystem across the board, then we can further ensure that our forests are forests and they are diverse and places for diversity across Europe, and that we can ensure that that we can start restoring vast amounts of landscapes that in the last 30, 40 years have been ripped with monocultures. And I think there is a huge value to everyone on doing that. And I think it's really interesting for me to hear Vilde talk about their healing process on a national scale. And I really hope that inspire other nations in Europe to do similar projects. And it's been incredibly generous to see that for me. And I think we can all take a lot of lessons from that. And yes, I think for me, bringing that way of thinking into urban planning is really vital if we want to respond to, having to respond to the climate emergency that our planet faces. So making cities more diverse and more wild is something that as a city architect, I'm really passionate about. Does that answer a little bit of your question?
No, of course. No, that's super interesting. I don't know, Vilde and Tiago, if you have...
I was thinking that, of course, it's very impressive that Norway as a country, decides to do this huge restoration of nature. But one of the things that we have talked a lot about when we talk about landscape healing is that it can be transferred, like the principles, into every, like you said, Christina, that it can go into any project, and it should probably be the mentality that when you build something, if you absolutely have to build something new, that you can think of what you're going to do the day that you have to take it away, like to make it as easy as possible to erase your footsteps, so to say. And that's, at least, maybe you don't make so flashy architecture, like on the front page and glossy stuff, but we need more of those solutions that are a little bit more humble, I think.
Yeah.
Should I jump in briefly? Just to say that I liked very much this idea by Christina, the idea of like the need to define what a forest is, or to redefine what a forest is, which I guess it's very much tied to the idea of what index of values that we stand for. And for instance, in my case, in the Amazon, in the Amazon, the case that I just addressed, I think this index of values comes very much from this idea of seeing like a state. It's this idea of like value is profit, right? And profit comes from any kind of extraction. Any kind of extraction is possible. So I think it also relates very much to this like very clear set, from a Western point of view, feel like separation between the human and what nature is, or even what cheap nature is. So that's why I'm been trying to bring in all these kind of counter methods, such as counter mapping, or like using jurisdiction to expand the limits of the indigenous territories. For instance, I didn't show it, but for instance, Paulo Tavares has a very interesting work in showing how the monocultures, the soy development in Cerrado in Brazil, just spread all over the place except for the indigenous territories, which are officially limited, right? It's in the Amazon and elsewhere, indigenous peoples are one of the most courageous and effective defenders of our great forests all over the world. So yeah, I'm just curious. So kind of my strategies are a little bit from like acting from below. And if may I just ask something, Catarina, to Christina, because I was interesting. It was a very interesting work, and I was wondering if there is space in contact, working with, for instance, the city council, if there is space and time and possibilities to having kind of more of these strategies from below somehow. I'm thinking of, for instance, I lived in London, in South London, and there was this beautiful old tide mill garden, I believe. It was a community garden, which is just absolutely scrapped, which is a new development. So I was just wondering if there is any possibility, not so much for design schemes, but perhaps for more for protocols to kind of avoid or expand other possibilities.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, and I think to go back on also onto Catarina's point earlier, which is about social value. So so the Mayor of London is as a kind of a research hub, say, that commissions research from different independent companies, and we are one of them. And it's and one of the key aspects of currently of judging a project, a Murray's project of value, is social value, and that's quite a wonderful premise, because we know we're having to think about you know, our communities in terms of circular economy. And by circular economy is looking at the resources that there are in any one place, and understanding the impact of any project. So in relation to projects that emerge from communities, it's something that actually the Mayor of London promotes a lot, and there are, you know, handful of grants that the mayor has currently. I think we're trying to do a little nature reserve, and I've been talking to the office, the Mayor of London office, to get an idea of which funding streams I could apply. And I basically got an email back with about 100 different possibilities. So there is a real movement in the UK for a bottom-up approach to regeneration. There is as a practice, we're actually doing 3 projects that have been initiated by communities. One is the restoration of an existing disused public conveniences that's listed, and it's very special, and a community group called the Last Helm really fought for the project and got quite a lot of money from the Mayor's Good Growth Fund to reactivate a public building that was closed for 20 years. So there is, I have to say that the current Mayor of London has done a lot of really good work, and is doing a lot of really good work enabling communities to have a bigger say in their places. and I hope that other places in Europe learn from the Mayor of London in this respect.
I have someone on YouTube asking what's the name of the community group.
So the last elm is the community group that we worked with for Bruce Grove Public Conveniences.
Yeah, last elm. I think you can also see the project on your website.
You can see
yeah.
we've got a website that shows that particular project too.
dkcm.com.
Yeah.
Publicity. No, but that's super interesting. When I was talking with a very high-ranking officer in the Norwegian, not military, but these defense estate agency people, he told me, because Norway is restoring a huge area of land in the middle of the country to wilderness status, which is quite a crazy thing to do because they have to tear down structures and get rid of roads, and there's a lot of controversy because it's taxpayers' money being used for destroying what local people see as a building that they use for their cows to, I don't know anything about rural living, but something to do with cows and cattle stuff. And he was telling me that it's the cost of a life, the cost of a young person to step on an unexploded ordnance is a really great cost, and that the money that goes into healing these landscapes is really important. So it goes down to such it's almost very raw to think of it in these terms, really put a price on a life, but I guess it kind of has to do with that. We have some questions coming in, quite a few actually. We have one from Paulo Moreira from INSTITUTO. He says, I watched the film Landscape Healing at the Oslo Architecture Triennale. It's so moving. Can you tell me, I guess Vilde, can you tell me a bit more about it and why the office thought making a film was important? That's an interesting question.
I can answer that question. It happens to be so that we knew a very, very good filmmaker, Richard John Seymour. And then this project had been we had done this for the Defense Estates Agency for 20 years. And it was just a box of 30 different sites, just small projects here and there, and not really a story, of them. They didn't have the name Landscape Healing. It was just this shooting range and that shooting range. And then together with him, the office kind of developed this story of how all these small or big projects were connected. And as for the medium film, I think that I'm going to be a little bit poetic. I think that time is such an important factor in this project because you have to work with nature and in its pace. So one of the things that makes this film so moving is the way that Richard has made it kind of a slow film, almost like images or paintings that are moving, and that really captures very well that aspect of the project. That, for example, on this national park in the photos that I showed, it's such a high altitude that it takes hundreds of years, for nature to heal itself. So, yeah, I hope that answers the question more or less.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting because we're talking about nature, which is a very big concept, nature, environment. In Tiago's project, probably or the project that he's researching, it's also very difficult to capture the issues at stake. And that was one comment that I wanted to tell you. It's super interesting how you are talking about these things, like the mapping, but kind of it's forensic ways of studying. And I think I'm getting off track now, but that's okay. I think collecting data and being able to talk about these issues, like finding a way to talk about these issues, such as making a film for 3RW, that was one way. And, you know, all these ways that Tiago showed, I think that's a really important and powerful way to talk about these themes. And as architects, although I don't know, Tiago, if you're an architect, I think you're an engineer. I saw on your LinkedIn page. Yeah.
I think I'm many things at this point, but I think I'm kind of a spatial practitioner. I like the term, it's very evasive.
That's cool. Yes, I think that's I think so many people could be called spatial practitioners, because I see my son, the way he explores a city now, like it's a bit, I'm a bit nervous because he touches everything, like all the floor and the, you know, where there's COVID everywhere, and he's touching everything. So I think spatial practitioners can be children, but also us, and also experts. I think it's very important to bring all these different perspectives, and that's why it's very interesting that Christina was talking about children, because I think it's very important to see how they experience the built environment and how they are influenced by it, and what kind of society we want for the future. Like, how can we teach and promote concepts of nature into everyday practice, whether it be architecture or policy making, or you know, researching different themes. Yeah, there's a few comments going on, but they're very long. Yeah, I think Christina.
A question for Tiago about his process and whether he sees potential parallels or potential opportunities for applying the same methods of forensic study in city contexts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a crucial point. I must say that all the work I've done so far, it's kind of ongoing work, was done from afar. So that's why I've been using all these, you know, remote sensing techniques, photogrammetry, etc.
I guess going on site would be a lot more costly as well for someone to pay. But have you ever been on site?
No, I've never been. So it was kind of like you may have noticed that I don't have that many people in my presentation, and I do it's on purpose, because I feel like this first part was about analyzing what I could do from afar, and I've tried to, I know, Facebook groups, etc. I made a bunch of comments, calls, and I had a bunch of conversations, but it was not very easy to really grasp what was going on. So I decided to focus on this spatial analysis first, and then move on to a second phase. I should have been in the Amazon last August. For obvious reasons, it didn't happen. I'll try again this August. So yeah, that's a bit of the next step, I hope. But with regards to, I feel like, regards to Christina's question on the using of forensic practices in the city, definitely I think this, use of techniques is very much context specific, right? I think there are a bunch of possibilities there. In this case, given the scale of the work and the distance, I use these ones, but there are a number of them that can definitely be used in the context of the city. Of course, forensic architecture, it's this epitome of a good use of these architectural tools to explore other dimensions of the city.
And Tiago, do you have an institution who you are working with or for, or do you have a client or? Is it speculative or self?
Yeah, not really. I mean, this project I've showed today. I started it in my MA in research architecture at Goldsmiths. So I'm not an architect by no means, but my MA has an architecture on the name. But no, I'm mostly an independent researcher right now. I've collaborated with forensic architecture before. I'm collaborating right now with Interpret, which is a different research agency that looks at environmental crimes and on the long term attempts to turn ecocide into international crime. But it's mostly this work, it's very much individual, and I feel like this is kind of work with regards to environment, it's very much collaborative. So anytime I can, I do collaborate with other people. This one it's a bit more individual.
Yeah. I mean, the United Nations has declared this decade that we just entered, 2021, as the decade of ecosystem restoration. So it really goes to show how important a theme it is to look at our ecosystems and environments and you know, make real cases for what's going on, what is being destroyed, and what is the impact of that, and what's the value of restoring these ecosystems. We have a question from Catarina Silva. She's a person who's going to be on one of these sessions, I think next week. She's saying, but is it possible to rewild? Isn't wild something that can only exist without the intervention of the human being? And I let it to you guys to answer.
I can answer it very fast in the case of landscape healing, because of course it's a very interesting philosophical question, but in landscape healing, it's definitely necessary that we as humans clean up our mess, because in these cases, I'm sure it's not every place like that, but in these cases, some areas are so polluted that the nature cannot heal itself. For example, if you just leave a shooting range just by itself, after 30 years, nothing has grown there. Like, it's absolutely not rewilding itself. So we have to do something about that, and that's at least the case for, and then after that, nature can do its thing. But before that, we have to step in and fix the things that we've messed up.
I think there is also kind of a basic premise in relation to, for instance, in the UK, the way, and I think in most Western world, where we have looked at conservation in relation to landscape, it's always been in trying to achieve a target, i.e. introducing a particular kind of animal and then making sure that that animal or of that particular flora or fauna survives within that landscape. So that's been really the way that we've been conserving our landscapes. And what makes a difference between traditional conservation practices and the rewilding practices that everyone in the conservation world is looking at is creating a framework. And the creation of that framework might have to include a major destruction of pollution, or the healing, in order to allow for these landscape to take over and this ecosystem to take over. But the fundamental difference is that the way that success is measured is not by will the otters survive, but it's more like setting up a framework on which natural ecosystems start to emerge, and that process is a process of learning and of unexpectedness, rather than trying to, for instance, in Portugal, we have amazing restoration conservation projects, for instance, in relation to the link. And very much the operation around that is to protect that species, and that's fabulous. Rewilding goes a little bit beyond that, and once the process of recuperation of the landscape. It's one that you are also observing what nature does, rather than promoting a particular species to be protected. And I think both processes are very interesting, and I think lessons learned from both will define the next decade, I think.
Yeah, of course. It's fascinating to work with this because, as you say, Christina, the nature is such a non-linear process. It's wilderness, and nature is riddled with uncertainty, unexpectedness. It's a question of time, like Vilde says. So it's very interesting to talk about this topic. There's a lot to talk about it, but I think our time is up, and this was super interesting. And thank you everyone for watching. The next session will be on Friday about living and health. It will be in Portuguese. So if you'd like to improve your Portuguese, if you don't speak it yet, you can tune in. But it will be very interesting. Every Wednesday and Friday at 5 o'clock for the next 3 weeks, we'll be here. Thank you so much, Christina, Tiago, and Vilde.
Thank you
for inviting us. Bye.
Thanks so much.
Bye, everyone.
Goodbye.